My name is Caroline Whitfield, and before this story reaches the moment where everything Eleanor believed gets taken apart in front of the people she said it to, I need you to understand one thing clearly. I was not invisible because I was unimportant. I was invisible because I chose to be. There is an enormous difference between those two things. And the confusion between them is precisely what Eleanor spent 6 years exploiting without ever realizing she was building the evidence of her own ignorance. Every building has two parts, the part people see and the part that keeps it standing. For 6 years, I was the second part, not because I had no choice, but because I calculated with the precision of someone who has spent 12 years understanding how organizations actually function, that it was where my skills would do the most work. I was right about that calculation. I was wrong about its cost. I will tell you about the dinner party. I will tell you what Eleanor said and what I did, and what happened afterward in that kitchen where everything had started 7 years earlier. But first, you need to understand what I was building and who was standing in front of it and why I let the picture stay the way it was for as long as I did. My husband's name is Marcus Whitfield. He is 42 years old. He founded Holloway Consulting Group in Atlanta, Georgia 7 years ago. The company does logistics and supply chain consulting for mid to large size corporate clients, and it has grown year over year from a 6-person operation running out of a shared office space into a firm with 31 employees and contracts with 4 major corporations. Marcus built that growth. I want to be accurate about what I mean by that because accuracy matters more to me than making a point. Marcus has a specific and genuine talent that cannot be taught and cannot be faked. He walks into a room and makes people believe in a vision. His voice carries warmth without effort. His handshake is firm and present. He remembers the names of his clients' children, asks about them 6 months later, and means the question. He can sit across from a skeptical executive, and through the specific combination of conviction and relatability, he was simply born with turn that skepticism into a signed agreement by the end of the meeting. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, the hardest single thing in any service business to manufacture or replace. What Marcus cannot do, what he has never been able to do, is manage anything on the back end of that talent. Spreadsheets produce in him a particular glazed expression I came to recognize as the visual equivalent of a system shutting down. Contract language gave him headaches he described as physical. He could not track an invoice accurately even when the invoice was the only document on his desk. The internal structure of how a business actually stays alive when the charismatic face of it is in a conference room, charming clients. Rather than watching the numbers, that architecture was entirely outside his natural range. I knew this about Marcus before I married him. I want to be honest about that. I had watched him for a year and a half before we were engaged, and I had seen the way he operated. I understood exactly what he was good at and exactly where he stopped. What I did not understand, not fully, not yet, was the difference between knowing something and living with the consequences of it for 6 years. Before Marcus, before Lily, before Atlanta, I spent 12 years in corporate operations. 3 years at a regional insurance group in Chicago, where I learned how compliance frameworks actually function under pressure. 9 years at a manufacturing conglomerate in Charlotte, where I ran the operational side of 4 separate divisions and rebuilt the vendor management system from the ground up when the existing one collapsed during a contract dispute. I hold 2 project management certifications. I renew them every 3 years without exception, not because anyone is checking, but because the discipline of staying current is part of how I work. I understand systems the way some people understand music. I do not have to think about it. I look at an organization and I see the flow underneath the surface where the pressure is building, where the information is getting stuck, where the process is designed for the person who created it rather than the person who has to use it. I see what is working and what is about to fail usually before the failure announces itself. When Holloway Consulting was 6 months old and hemorrhaging money through operational inefficiency, I sat down at our kitchen table with Marcus's books and spent 3 weeks rebuilding the entire infrastructure of his business. I systematized the invoicing process, which had been inconsistent to the point of being functionally random. I renegotiated 2 vendor contracts that were priced above market rate because no one had run a competitive comparison before signing. I built a project tracking system simple enough that Marcus's small team could actually use it without training. And I identified 3 billing errors that had cost the firm $42,000 in the months before I looked at the books. I did all of this without a title, without a salary, without credit in any formal sense, because Marcus was the face of Holloway Consulting, and I had decided deliberately and with full awareness of what I was deciding that I would be the architecture. It was the most rational professional decision I had ever made. It was also, though I would not understand this for years, the decision that gave Eleanor Whitfield the space to construct a version of our lives that had almost nothing to do with reality. I need to give you Eleanor the way she deserves fully without reducing her to something simpler than she is, because understanding her makes everything that comes later heavier and more honest. Eleanor Whitfield is 68 years old. She lives in Savannah, Georgia, 2 hours south of Atlanta. She spent 30 years as a property manager running a portfolio of residential buildings with the specific efficiency of someone who learned early that sentiment and business are 2 separate categories and that confusing them costs money. She raised Marcus alone from the time he was 14 after her husband Harold died of a stroke on a Tuesday afternoon in their kitchen. She raised him with the intensity of a woman who had decided that her child was her legacy and his success was her vindication. She worked. She sacrificed. She made herself indispensable to his development in every way she knew how. She is not a simple villain. I want to be careful about that. She is a genuinely complicated woman whose love for her son calcified over the decades into something both protective and in its own way suffocating. She believes she understands Marcus because she manufactured him, built him through sacrifice and discipline, and an iron commitment to his potential. She therefore believes she understands his business because his business is an extension of him and he is her creation. And I was, in her estimation, the woman who had married into that creation. Pretty enough, educated, she supposed, pleasant in social settings, but not essential, not the point. She formed this opinion at our first meeting, dinner at her home in Savannah, 14 months before Marcus and I were married, and she never substantially revised it. She treated my professional background as a polite footnote, the kind of thing you mention once and then set aside. When I described my work in Charlotte, she nodded with the expression of someone hearing information they have already decided is not relevant. There is something else about Eleanor that I did not learn until much later. Something her brother Ted told me that reframed everything I had observed about her. But that comes later. What matters now is the picture as I understood it in those early years, a woman who had worked hard, who had built something of her own, and who had decided without malice and without examination that I had not. The phone call happened 8 months after Marcus and I were married, 6 months after Holloway Consulting landed its first major corporate contract. Marcus and I had been sitting in the living room when the contract came through by email. He read it twice, looked at me, and said nothing for a moment. Then he called his mother. I had spent 3 months building that contract, not the relationship. Marcus built the relationship, flew to Cincinnati twice, had dinner with the senior vice president, followed up with exactly the right touch. That part was his, genuinely and completely. but the proposal framework that shaped how we position our services, the research into the client's specific operational pain points. The 40-slide deck Marcus walked into the final meeting with, which was structured around a problem identification and solution architecture I had developed over 6 weeks. That was mine. Marcus knew I had helped. He said so in the way people say things when they mean them, but do not fully understand their weight. Eleanor's reaction was simpler. When Marcus told her about the contract, she said she was proud of him. When he mentioned I had helped with the proposal, she said that was nice. She said it the way you say something is nice when you have already moved on to the next sentence in your head. Several months after the contract, Eleanor called Marcus while I happened to be sitting next to him in our kitchen. He put the call on speaker without thinking about it. They talked for 20 minutes about the contract, the client, the possibilities for the firm's growth. Eleanor's voice was warm and animated, and full of a particular pride that made her sound younger than she was. Near the end of the call, she paused and said, "Is Caroline there?" Marcus said yes. "Hi, Caroline," Eleanor said. "Thank you for keeping the home front running while Marcus does all this." And then she continued talking to Marcus. I set my coffee down. I looked at the table. Marcus did not register what had just happened because to him it had not happened. It was a pleasantry. It was his mother being friendly. To me, it was a data point, not the first, but the first clear one. I filed it and moved forward. I want to give you 6 years the way they actually were, not as a catalog of suffering and not as evidence for a case I am building against anyone. The facts do not need editorializing. They are what they are. Year 1, I rebuilt the operational infrastructure of Holloway Consulting from our kitchen table during Lily's nap times. Lily was 6 months old when I started, and walking with that particular unsteady confidence of a child who has recently discovered she can go where she wants by the time I finished the first full system overhaul. I was on maternity leave from a job I had intended to return to. I did not return. The firm needed more than part-time attention, and I made the calculation that my skills were more immediately valuable there than they would be in a corporate position I had already mastered. It was a rational decision. I have never regretted the decision itself. What I did not fully account for was what 6 years of invisible labor would cost me in ways that had nothing to do with money. Year 2, the first major corporate contract. 3 months of preparation, Marcus in Cincinnati closing it with the warmth and conviction that no one else in that room could have matched. And then the parking lot phone call to Eleanor. Year 3, we hired Diana Park. She was 28 sharp in the specific way that means she asked the right questions before anyone thinks to ask them. Her title was Operations Manager, reporting to Marcus officially and to me practically. Diana figured out the actual power structure within her first month. She came to me directly one afternoon and said she needed to understand who was actually running the operational side. She was not asking to be difficult. She was asking because she is someone who cannot function without accurate information, and the official organizational chart was not giving her accurate information. I told her she had already answered her own question. From that point forward, Diana and I worked together with the quiet efficiency of two people who understand the same systems and do not need to explain themselves to each other. She never made the arrangement awkward. She had the professional grace to treat it as simply the way things were. Year 4, a vendor dispute that Marcus had mishandled escalated toward litigation. I resolved it in 2 phone calls and a revised service agreement. Marcus knew it got fixed. He thanked me with genuine warmth and then moved on to the next week. He did not know the details of what had been at stake because I had managed the situation before he had a chance to see its full weight. Year 5, the firm hit $1 million in annual revenue. Marcus threw a party in our home. Eleanor stood in our living room and toasted her son's brilliance in front of 40 people. I refilled the water glasses and later washed the dishes. Diana came into the kitchen near the end of the evening and picked up a dish towel without being asked. She stood next to me at the sink and dried while I washed, and neither of us said anything because nothing needed to be said. It was the most honest 10 minutes of that entire year. Year 6, three things converged. The marriage began a slow and quiet decline that neither Marcus nor I named aloud. Diana was promoted to Director of Operations, a title that finally reflected what she had been doing for 3 years. And Eleanor, made confident by 6 years of watching me stand quietly in rooms and receiving no correction, decided she understood exactly what kind of person I was. Now I need to tell you about something Eleanor said in Savannah 6 weeks before the dinner party, because without it you will not understand why the dinner party landed the way it did. Marcus, Lillian, and I drove down for a weekend visit. Saturday lunch at Eleanor's house, the kind of meal she prepares with careful effort, the table set properly, the food cooked from scratch, the whole occasion organized around Marcus's presence in a way that I had long since accepted as simply how things were in that house. Lily was 7. She had her father's social ease and my tendency to observe before she speaks. She sat across from Eleanor at the lunch table and ate for a while, and then she looked up with the complete absence of self-consciousness that belongs only to children and asked the question. Grandma Eleanor, Mom said she helps with Dad's company. Do you know what Mom does there? The table shifted, not dramatically, but I felt it. Eleanor set her fork down and smiled at Lily with the warm authority of a grandmother who has an answer ready. Your mom takes care of the family, sweetheart. That's very important work. Lily nodded and went back to eating. I did not move for a moment. I was aware of my hands on the table. I was aware of Garrett Foley sitting at the far end, Marcus's business partner, who had been invited for the weekend and who was at that moment looking at the surface of his water glass with the focus of a man who has decided that the glass requires his complete attention. After lunch, while Lily was inside helping Eleanor clear the table, Garrett and I walked out to the driveway together. Garrett, I saw. I looked at him. He was a few inches taller than Marcus, broader through the shoulders, a man who had built his half of the business through the kind of steady operational competence that Marcus recognized and depended on, even if he could not fully articulate why. Garrett and I had always understood each other in the way of two people who think similarly about how things actually work. How long have you known? I asked. He was quiet for a moment. Year 2. And you never said anything. No, I waited, because I didn't know how to say it without making everything harder for you, he said. He was not looking at me. Every version of that conversation I ran in my head ended with Marcus in the middle and the situation worse. So you stayed quiet? Yes. I looked at him directly. At least you were honest about it. I got into the car and waited for Marcus and Lily to come out. Garrett's silence had been a form of loyalty to Marcus. I understood that. It had also been a form of abandonment of me. I did not say this to him. I filed it the same way I had filed the phone call years earlier, and I held it in the particular place where I keep things I am not yet ready to spend. The dinner party was Eleanor's idea. She hosted it at our home, which she had taken to doing with a frequency and proprietary energy that I had long since stopped discussing with Marcus, because discussing it required a conversation about his mother that produced diminishing returns. 14 guests, Eleanor and Beverly Holt, her closest friend from the charity board they both served on. Marcus and Garrett. Richard Crane and Susan Merrill, both corporate clients who had become socially adjacent over the years. 2 of Marcus's cousins. And Diana, whom Marcus liked to include at social events because she was sharp and easy in a room, and because he understood on some level that her presence represented the firm well. Diana arrived early and took a seat 2 chairs down from mine. She had the particular stillness of someone who has assessed the room and is waiting to see what it produces. I had planned the menu, I had ordered the catering, I had arranged the table and confirmed the flower delivery, and handled every logistical element of an event being thrown in my own home to celebrate my husband by his mother. Marcus had confirmed the guest list. The evening before the dinner party, I was setting the table when Lily came downstairs and stood in the doorway of the dining room watching me work. "Mom, why is Grandma Eleanor having the party here?" I straightened a fork. She wanted to do something for Dad, but this is our house. I stopped. I looked at my daughter, 7 years old, in her socks, on the hardwood floor, with her father's dark eyes and a question that was more accurate than she knew. "Yes," I said, "it is. So why doesn't she have it at her house?" I crossed the room and crouched down to her level, which is something I do when I want her to understand that I am taking her seriously. "Some people show love by taking over," I said. "It doesn't mean they own the place." Lily thought about this. "Do you mind?" I looked at her for a long moment. "I know what's mine," I said. She nodded, apparently satisfied, and went back upstairs. I stood up and finished setting the table. It was the last time that evening that I answered a question by making it smaller than it was. What I did not know that night, what I would not learn until much later, was that Eleanor's brother, Ted Whitfield, had called her 3 days before the party. Ted is 72 and lives in Nashville and has known his sister longer than anyone alive. He had heard about the Savannah lunch through Garrett, who had been there, and who had described in the blunt shorthand of two old friends on the phone exactly what Eleanor had said to Lily and how Caroline had gone still at the table. What Ted knows and what Eleanor has never told Marcus is that for the first 15 years of Eleanor's career in property management, she worked under a man named Wallace. Wallace was her direct superior, well-liked and well-connected, and entirely dependent on Eleanor's analytical work. The market assessments that informed acquisition decisions, the financial models that made the portfolio profitable, the operational restructuring that tripled occupancy rates in 3 years. Eleanor produced all of it. Wallace signed his name to it. Eleanor stayed because she needed the job. And because she believed, as many people in her position believed, that if she was patient and produced excellent work, the recognition would come in time. It came eventually years later after Wallace retired and Eleanor finally had the room to be seen. She built something real and lasting after that. She is genuinely formidable. But she carried the years with Wallace the way people carry old injuries, not always aware of the ache until something presses on exactly the right spot. Ted pressed on it. He called on a Thursday evening, and the conversation lasted nearly an hour. And when it was over, Eleanor sat in her kitchen in Savannah and did not speak to anyone for the rest of the night. None of this I knew when I was setting the table for her dinner party. None of this I knew when the guests arrived and the wine was poured and the evening began with the comfortable rhythm of people who know each other well enough to be easy in a room together. Marcus told stories well, as he always did. Richard laughed at the right moments. Susan asked thoughtful questions. Beverly sat next to Eleanor and basked warmly in the reflected glow of a sun Eleanor had built, which was Beverly's idea of an excellent evening. I watched it all from my place at the table. I had been watching for 6 years, and I had learned in 6 years of watching that the most dangerous thing Eleanor Whitfield possessed was not her certainty about Marcus. It was her certainty about me. She had decided what I was on the night we met, and she had never once asked a question that might disturb that picture. Not out of cruelty, out of a specific kind of confidence that hardens in people who have worked hard and built things and earned the right, as they see it, to trust their own judgment about the world. She trusted her judgment about me. She had 6 years of uncontested evidence, as far as she could see, that she was right. Beverly poured more wine. Marcus leaned back in his chair with the ease of a man who is exactly where he wants to be. Lilu was upstairs asleep. The candles had burned down an inch. And then Beverly, with the cheerful innocence of someone who genuinely wanted to compliment her friend, asked Eleanor what had made the difference for Marcus. What was his secret? Eleanor smiled. I had seen that smile before. It was the smile of a woman who has been waiting for exactly this question, this shape of an opening, this invitation to be the authority on the subject she has spent years becoming an expert in. She sat up slightly. She spoke about Marcus's work ethic and his relationships and his inherited intelligence and the discipline she had built into him across a childhood defined by sacrifice and commitment. And then she looked at me. Something moved across her face, a small, quiet decision being made. I'll tell you what did not make the difference, she said. Her voice was composed, even pleasant, the tone of a woman who believes she is offering an amusing and obvious observation. It certainly wasn't a wife who sat home for 6 years while her husband built everything. The table went silent. Garrett's glass stopped halfway to his mouth. Diana looked at her plate. Marcus looked at me. I looked at Eleanor. And I felt in the 4 seconds that followed something I want to describe accurately. Because getting it wrong would make what came next seem like anger, and it was not anger. It was quieter than anger. It was the specific sensation of a lock releasing. After 6 years of patience, of calculation, of choosing silence, because silence served the work, the door opened from the inside. I had been waiting without fully knowing I was waiting for the moment that made staying invisible cost more than being seen. That moment had just arrived. Rage would have been understandable. Rage would have been the wrong tool. What Caroline Whitfield felt in the 4 seconds after Eleanor finished her sentence was something colder and more precise than rage. It was the specific clarity that arrives when a person who has been patient for a very long time finally stops calculating whether patience is still worth the price. She had run that calculation every year for 6 years. The answer had always come back the same: stay quiet, let the work speak. Eventually protect the arrangement that kept the firm functional and the marriage manageable. The answer changed at that dinner table, not with a scene, not with raised voices or a dramatic pushback from her chair. Caroline did not perform her decisions. She executed them. That's interesting, she said. Her voice was level, conversational, the voice of a woman who has decided to solve a problem rather than react to one. Eleanor's smile held. Around the table, no one moved. Richard Crane had set down his fork at some point in the last 30 seconds without noticing he had done it. Susan Merrill was very still. Garrett was looking at the tablecloth. Diana had raised her eyes from her plate and was watching Caroline with the focused attention of someone who has been waiting a long time for a particular thing to happen and is now watching it happen. Marcus was looking at his wife. His expression was the expression of a man who understands that something requires action and does not yet know what action to take. Carolyn recognized it. She had seen that expression in quieter contexts for 6 years. It was in miniature the entire architecture of their problem. She did not look at him long. I'd love for you to explain to our guest how the company operates, Caroline said to Eleanor, since you understand it so well. Eleanor's smile did not waver. Marcus runs it. That's how it operates. Specifically, Caroline said. She tilted her head by a degree. The contract management process, the vendor framework, the compliance documentation, the proposal architecture we use for new client acquisition. A pause. Since you're the authority on what built this company, I'd love to hear you walk everyone through the back end. The silence that followed was different from the silence after Eleanor's original comment. That silence had been shock. This one was charged with something else entirely. Everyone at the table understood, with the speed that social intelligence produces in a room full of adults, exactly what was happening. Eleanor did not answer. She could not answer, and the table knew it, and Eleanor knew the table knew it. and the fault line that had appeared in her composure when Caroline began speaking widened now into something that could not be walked back. Caroline let the silence hold for exactly as long as it needed to. Then she turned to Richard Crane. Richard was 55, a man who had built his career on the ability to read situations accurately and respond to them without wasted motion. He had been working with Halloway Consulting for 3 years. He had worked directly with Caroline for most of that time, though the organizational chart suggested otherwise. Richard, Caroline said, when we renegotiated your service tier in March, who did you work with on the contract language? Richard looked at her. He had been recalibrating something since Eleanor spoke. She could see it in the set of his shoulder. You, he said. Caroline, you and I went through 3 drafts. She nodded and turned to Susan Merrill. Susan was 48, the kind of person who notices everything and says less than she knows. She had been working with the firm for 2 years. Her fork was already down. Susan, when the compliance audit came up last fall and your team had questions about the documentation framework, who handled that? You, Susan said. Her voice was clear and unhurried. Entirely you. For 3 weeks. You rebuilt the whole framework. Caroline nodded once more. She looked back at the table. I have been the operational architecture of this company for 6 years, she said. Her tone had not changed. Conversational, factual. No title, no salary from the firm. I chose to be invisible because visibility was never the point. The work was the point. She looked at Eleanor directly. I sat home for 6 years. You're right about that. I sat home and I built the back end of everything your son is standing on. Garrett put his glass down. He looked at Eleanor and said quietly, she's not exaggerating, not even slightly. Eleanor's mouth opened, closed. The dinner ended 30 minutes later. It did not end dramatically. It ended the way these things end when they happen in front of people who are not family, with a kind of careful efficiency, everyone finding their coats, their thanks, their exits, processing what they had witnessed, while they still had the social cover of departure to hide behind. Susan squeezed Caroline's arm at the door. Richard shook her hand specifically with a look that communicated something he had apparently decided words were not equipped to carry. Diana hugged her, held on for a moment longer than a casual embrace, and whispered into her shoulder, I have been waiting 6 years for that. Then she left. Garrett was last. He stopped in the doorway and looked at Marcus. The look between them lasted about 3 seconds and contained, as far as Caroline could observe, an entire conversation. You need to handle this, Garrett said. Then he was gone. Eleanor left with Beverly without saying anything substantive to Caroline. She said goodnight to Marcus. The quality of her silence toward Caroline as she moved through the foyer was the silence of a woman who has not yet located the narrative that will let her speak and who is disciplined enough not to speak until she finds it. Beverly paused at the threshold. She looked at Eleanor, then at Caroline, then back at Eleanor. She did not say anything, but something passed across her eyes that was not her usual warmth, something more complicated, something closer to reckoning. Then she followed Eleanor out into the night. The house was quiet. Caroline stood in the dining room for a moment after the door closed, looking at the table. The remains of a meal she had planned and arranged and overseen in her own home for a party that had not been her idea. The candles had burned to their holders. 2 glasses still had wine in them. She started clearing. She was at the kitchen sink when she heard Lily. Footsteps on the stairs, soft and unhurried, the particular rhythm of a child who is not fully woken up and is navigating more by habit than intention. Lily appeared in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas, her hair loose, her eyes at half-mast. Is the party over? It's over, sweetheart. Lily crossed the kitchen without further question and put her arms around her mother from the side, her cheek against Caroline's arm, the way she had done since she was small enough to fit entirely under Caroline's elbow. She did not ask what had happened. She did not ask why the air in the house felt the way it felt. She was 7 years old, and she simply understood with the animal clarity that children carry before the world teaches them to override it that her mother needed to be touched. Carolyn held her daughter's head against her arm and looked at the window above the sink, which showed her nothing but her own reflection in the dark outside. Marcus stood in the doorway behind them. She did not look at him. She knew he was there. "Go back to bed, baby," she said to Lily. Lily released her padded back across the kitchen and went upstairs without protest. Her footsteps faded. The house settled. Marcus came into the kitchen. He did not sit. He stood near the island, hands in his pockets, and said nothing for a long time. Carolyn washed a glass she did not need to wash because her hands needed something to do. "Caroline, you already know," she said. "Why didn't you tell me how bad it had gotten with her?" She set the glass down. "Because you didn't ask. And because every time I tried to have a version of this conversation, it became about managing your mother's feelings. And then it became about managing your feelings, about managing her feelings, and the actual conversation never happened." He absorbed this. He was a man of genuine intelligence in the ways he was intelligent, and he knew when a thing was true. "She shouldn't have said that." "No, I should have said something at the table." "Yes, I didn't know how." "I know." She turned to face him. "But Marcus, you did know. That's the honest and terrible part. You knew she was wrong the moment she said it. You knew what I do. You know what I've built. And you sat there and waited to see what would happen because choosing silence felt safer than choosing a side." The word he did not say hung in the air between them. "Staying quiet wasn't neutral," she said. "There is no neutral position when someone is being diminished at your own table." He was quiet for a long time after that. "What do you need from me?" he asked finally. She looked at him. In 6 years of marriage, she had answered versions of this question by making herself smaller, by asking for less than she meant, by translating her actual needs into requests he could manage, without being required to examine the larger structure they were living in. She did not do that now. "I need you to decide what you actually know about how this company runs," she said. "All of it, every piece. And then I need you to sit down with your mother and tell her. Not a summary, not the polished version, everything." "She's my mother, Caroline." "I know. That's exactly why it has to come from you. If I tell her it's a conflict, if you tell her it's the truth, and she needs to hear it as the truth from the person she built her entire understanding of this company around." Marcus looked at her for a long time. "And us," he said. "One thing at a time." He nodded slowly. He understood she could see that there was no exit available to him in this kitchen, no way to move the conversation toward comfort or resolution without passing through the things she was asking him to pass through. That was new. In 6 years, there had always been a way around. She had stopped building him one. Marcus did not go to Savannah the next day or the day after. He spent a week in a kind of deliberate, visible accounting that Carolyn had never seen from him before going through the firm's operational records, sitting with Diana for 2 hours on a Thursday morning, and asking her to walk him through the vendor framework from its origins, pulling up contracts on his laptop late at night, and reading them with the focused attention of a man who is learning for the first time what the documents he has been signing actually contain. He asked Caroline to prepare a summary of her contributions to the firm over 6 years. She prepared it the way she prepared everything, thoroughly, with dates and figures and measurable outcomes attached to each item, the vendor renegotiations and what they had saved, the proposal systems and which contracts they had produced, the compliance restructuring and the audit it had successfully navigated, the dispute that had nearly become litigation, and the 2 phone calls that had ended it. She did not editorialize. The numbers did not require it. Marcus read it 3 times. On the night before he drove to Savannah, he sat alone in his home office with the summary on the desk in front of him and did not read it again. He had already read it enough to know it by heart. What he did instead was sit with it in the specific way a person sits with something they have been avoiding for a long time and have finally stopped running from. He looked at the column of dates. Month 1 year 1 when Lily was 6 months old and he had been at a dinner celebrating the firm's first client while Caroline sat in the same house rebuilding the infrastructure that made that client possible. He had not asked what she was doing that night. He had not asked because he had understood on some level, and understanding would have required him to do something with the understanding. He said it out loud in the empty room, not for effect, but because some truths need to be spoken before they can be fully held. I did not build this company. I was the face of it. She built it. No one heard him. That was not the point. The point was that he heard himself. And when he drove to Savannah the next morning, he carried that sentence with him in the particular way a man carries something he has finally decided to stop setting down. That evening, while Marcus was still in Savannah, Beverly Holt called Eleanor. Beverly had been Eleanor's closest friend for 11 years since they had served together on the board of a community arts foundation and discovered over a working dinner that stretched past midnight that they were more alike than either had expected. Beverly was practical, loyal, and in possession of a particular social courage that most people her age had traded away in exchange for comfort. She had been at the dinner table. She had watched Richard and Susan confirm what Caroline had said. She had watched Eleanor's composure fracture in real time. She waited 5 days before she called, long enough for Eleanor to have processed or attempted to process what had happened. Not so long that Eleanor would have had time to build a new narrative so solid it could not be entered. Eleanor, Beverly said when her friend picked up, "I need to say something and I need you to actually hear it." Eleanor said she was listening. "I was sitting at that table," Beverly said. "I heard Richard. I heard Susan. I watched Caroline's face when you said what you said. And I need you to understand that I am not calling to take sides. I am calling because you are my friend and because what happened at that dinner is something you cannot simply reconstruct your way around." Eleanor said she was still processing. "I know you are," Beverly said. "But Eleanor, I think you saw what you wanted to see for a very long time. I think you made Caroline into something manageable in your mind because the alternative required you to revise a picture you had been living inside of for years. And I think you know that too now that you've had 5 days with it." The line was quiet. "She never told me," Eleanor said finally. "You never asked. And you never gave her a reason to tell you." Another silence longer than the first. "Ted called me," Eleanor said, "before the dinner, 3 days before." Beverly waited. "He told me something about Wallace." A pause. "About what those years were like. He said he thought I had done to Caroline what Wallace had done to me." Beverly said nothing. She understood from 30 years of knowing people that there are moments when the most powerful thing you can offer is the space for someone to keep talking. "I told him he was wrong," Eleanor said. "And now?" The line was very quiet. "I don't know," Eleanor said. It was, Beverly would think later, the most honest answer Eleanor Whitfield had given anyone in years. Marcus came home from Savannah on Saturday evening. He sat across from Caroline at the kitchen table and told her about the conversation with his mother, the way he told things when they mattered to him carefully, without omitting the parts that reflected badly on himself. He had shown Eleanor the summary. He had walked her through every item, every figure, every outcome, not as an indictment, but as a correction. Not with blame, with precision. Eleanor had been quiet through most of it. She had asked questions, not to challenge the information, but to understand it, which surprised him. And then something had happened that neither of them had anticipated. Eleanor had said, "Ted told me about Wallace before you came." Marcus had not known who Wallace was. Eleanor told him. The 15 years, the work she had produced, and the name that had gone on it. When she finished, she looked at the summary on the table between them and was quiet for a long moment. Then she looked at her son directly and said, I have done to your wife exactly what was done to me. I saw it clearly for the first time when you laid all of this out, and I do not have an excuse for it. Marcus told Caroline that this was the moment the conversation changed completely, that before it he had been prepared to push through Eleanor's resistance, that after it there was no resistance left to push through, only a woman confronting something about herself that she had not known she was carrying. He had still said the hardest sentence because it needed to be said. You had already decided who she was. You never asked a question that might have changed that picture. Eleanor had not spoken for a full minute. Then she said she owed Caroline a conversation. Marcus finished and looked at his wife across the table. He had the expression of a man who has done a difficult thing and is not yet sure whether he has done it adequately. She looked back at him. What happened between you two? She asked. Not about Eleanor, about them. He was quiet for a moment. I think I have been standing on something I didn't fully look at, he said, for a long time. Yes, I don't know how to build things the way you do. I know you don't, but I've been letting that be your problem instead of mine. He looked at the table. That's what I've been doing. I've been letting it be your problem to manage and your problem to carry, and then telling myself it was partnership because I was grateful. Caroline let this sit in the air between them. It was the most accurate thing he had said about their marriage in 6 years. It was also the beginning of something rather than the resolution of something, and she had learned enough about the difference to know better than to treat it as a rival. One thing at a time, she said again, but this time when she said it, it meant something different than it had the night before. The following Wednesday, Eleanor called. Carolyn was in the small office at the back of the house, sitting at the desk she had bought with her own money and positioned to face the window. She let the phone ring twice before she answered. The call lasted 47 minutes. Eleanor did not begin with an apology. She worked toward it the way someone works towards something that requires them to dismantle a structure they have lived inside carefully, with pauses doubling back occasionally when the path became difficult. She said she had seen what she wanted to see. She said she had made assumptions because assumptions were easier than questions, and that she had been comfortable with those assumptions for long enough that she had stopped examining them entirely. And then she said something Caroline had not expected. My brother Ted reminded me of something I had not thought about in a long time, Eleanor said. Her voice had a quality in it that Caroline had genuinely never heard before, a kind of stripped-down steadiness, as if she were speaking from behind whatever she normally kept in front of her. There was a man I worked for in the early years, Wallace. For 15 years, I did the analysis and the modeling and the work that made the portfolio profitable, and he stood in front of it. He signed his name to things I built. And I stayed because I needed the position and because I believed that if I kept producing excellent work, it would eventually be seen. Caroline was very still. Ted told me I had done to you what Wallace did to me, Eleanor said. I told him he was wrong. A pause. I've had a week to think about it. And then Marcus came and laid out what you built item by item. And I understood that Ted was not wrong. She did not need to say more. The sentence completed itself. The comment at the dinner table, Eleanor said finally, and here her voice found a lower register, flatter and more exposed, was unforgivable. She stopped. That's my word for it, not yours, mine. Caroline held the phone and looked out the window at the yard. I appreciate this call, she said. I want you to know that. Can you forgive me? Forgiveness is a process, Caroline said, not a sentence. I'm not going to give you a sentence today. I understand. But I believe you mean what you're saying, and that matters. She heard Eleanor exhale slowly on the other end of the line. Not relief exactly, something more complicated than relief. I'd like to do better, Eleanor said. I know, Caroline said. We'll see what that looks like. She ended the call and sat for a moment at her desk without moving the phone still in her hand, the yard outside the window going gold in the afternoon light. 47 minutes, the most honest conversation she had ever had with Eleanor Whitfield. She thought about Wallace. She thought about what it cost a person to carry that for 15 years and then spend 30 more years becoming someone formidable enough that no one would ever do it to them again. And how a person who survives that can still, without knowing it, become the very thing they survived. The symmetry of it did not absolve Eleanor, but it made her human in a way that determined what the next year could look like if both of them were willing to do the work. Caroline set the phone down on the desk. She opened her laptop. There was still a company to run. And for the first time in 6 years, that sentence meant something different than it had the day before. Catherine Ames did not waste time on comfort. That was the first thing Carolyn noticed when she walked into the office on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the dinner party. The space was precise and uncluttered, the kind of environment that communicates before anyone speaks, that the person who works here values clarity over impression. Catherine was 46 with close-cropped gray at her temples and the particular stillness of someone who has spent 20 years listening carefully to what people say and what they leave out. She let Caroline sit. She let her settle. Then she asked the question no one else had thought to ask. What do you want this to be? Caroline looked at her. A correction, Catherine said, or a recognition. They are not the same thing and they don't produce the same outcome. A correction fixes what went wrong. A recognition names what was true all along and builds forward from that naming. Both are legitimate, but they require different strategies and they prioritize different things. Carolyn had prepared for questions about documentation about the firm's financials, about the legal mechanics of formalizing an informal arrangement. She had not prepared for this question. Both, she said. Catherine nodded. She did not write anything down. Tell me about the company, Caroline told her. Not the summary she had prepared for Marcus, which had been organized around contributions and outcomes. She told Catherine about the structure of the firm as it actually functioning the operational layer beneath the public face, the systems she had built and the systems she had maintained and the places where her fingerprints were on everything even when her name was on nothing. Catherine listened without interrupting for 20 minutes. Then she opened a folder and slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. It was a compensation analysis. COO salary ranges in logistics consulting firms of comparable size and revenue in the state of Georgia adjusted across a 6-year window. The numbers were broken into columns year 1 through year 6, median market rate, upper quartile, lower quartile. Carolyn looked at the bottom line. The aggregate figure representing the gap between what she had earned from the firm and what the market would have paid her for the same work. She looked at it for a long time without speaking. The number was not a surprise in the way that new information surprises you. It was a surprise in the way that seeing something you have always known made concrete and specific surprises you the particular weight of a thing you have carried without measuring finally being placed on a scale. I don't want to fight my husband, she said. You don't have to. Catherine's voice was even. But you need to separate two things clearly. The marriage and the company, they are both in need of adjustment. They require different mechanisms. Conflating them will make both harder to resolve. What does the company adjustment look like? A formal role, an appropriate title, compensation that reflects your current market value going forward and acknowledges the inequity of the preceding 6 years. Your name on the legal documents the client contracts the firm's public materials. Catherine paused. Not as a courtesy to you, as an accurate description of what already exists. Caroline sat with this. It was the most direct sentence anyone had spoken to her about her own situation in 6 years. Not sympathetic, not careful, direct. She found that she was deeply grateful for it. "When can we start?" she asked. She did not tell Marcus about the meeting with Catherine immediately. Not because she was hiding it, but because she had learned in the weeks since the dinner party to distinguish between the conversations that needed to happen in a particular order and the ones that could happen in parallel. She had been managing sequencing for 6 years. She knew how it worked. What she did instead was wait. 3 days after her meeting with Catherine, she came into the living room where Marcus was sitting with a legal pad working through something she could see was not coming easily to him. He had been doing this more often in the weeks since the dinner, sitting with the internal mechanics of the firm, in a way he had never done before, not because she had asked him to, but because he had finally understood that not knowing was a choice he had been making, not a circumstance he had been in. She sat across from him. "I met with a lawyer," she said. He looked up. "Her name is Catherine Ames. She specializes in business partnership structures and employment agreements." She kept her voice even. "I'm going to formalize my role in the company, title, compensation, documentation, all of it. I wanted you to hear it from me directly before the paperwork begins." Marcus set the legal pad down. He did not speak for a long moment. She watched him work through it, could see the layers of response moving across his face, the instinct toward defensiveness, the recognition that defensiveness was not a position he had earned, the something underneath both of those that was harder to name. "What's the compensation figure?" he asked. She told him. He looked at the window, then at the floor, then at his hands. "That's what I should have been paying you," he said. "Yes." "For 6 years." "Yes." He was quiet for another long moment. When he looked up, his face had settled into something that was not quite shame and not quite grief, but contained elements of both. "I told myself I was grateful. I told myself that meant I understood what you were contributing." Gratitude and understanding are not the same thing. I know that now. You knew it before, Marcus. That's what I need you to sit with. You knew on some level the size of what I was carrying. You chose not to measure it because measuring it would have required you to do something with the measurement. The room was very quiet. "What do you need from me right now?" he asked. It was the same question he had asked in the kitchen the night of the dinner party. But the quality of it was different. 3 weeks earlier, it had been a question looking for a way out. Now it was a question looking for a way in. "Sign what Catherine puts in front of you," Caroline said, "and mean it." He nodded. "I'll mean it." She believed him. Not because she had decided to trust him reflexively, the way she had sometimes done in the years before the dinner party, but because she had watched him for 3 weeks doing the hard and unglamorous work of actually looking at what he had not been looking at, and she had seen something genuine in the effort. Genuine was not the same as sufficient, but it was a real place to begin. Catherine moved efficiently. The documents took 2 weeks to prepare, and another week to review and revise. Carolyn read every page herself, not because she did not trust Catherine, but because she was constitutionally incapable of signing anything she had not personally examined, which was she reflected exactly the kind of person the firm had needed at its foundation and was only now officially acknowledging. On the day the contracts were signed, Caroline became Chief Operating Officer of Holloway Consulting Group. Her name appeared on the firm's legal registration documents. It appeared on client contracts. It appeared on the letterhead that had carried only Marcus's name for 7 years. She called Diana first. Diana was in the office when the call came through. Caroline could hear the ambient sound of the space she had helped design, the particular acoustic quality of a room that had been laid out for efficiency rather than appearance. She told Diana what had been finalized. There was a silence on the line that lasted about 4 seconds. Then Diana said, I need to call you back," and ended the call. She appeared at the door of the back office at the house 40 minutes later. She had driven across the city in the middle of a workday without texting ahead, which was so entirely unlike Diana's usual operating mode that Caroline simply opened the door and stepped back. Diana walked in, sat down in the chair across from Caroline's desk, and cried. Not the restrained, professional kind of crying that people do when they are trying to maintain composure, the other kind. When she had steadied herself, she looked up. "From the first month," she said, "I knew from the first month what you were doing and what it was worth, and I didn't know how to fix it." "You couldn't have fixed it." "I know, but I wanted to." She looked at the desk, at the familiar landscape of papers and screens, and the cup of cold coffee that was always there. "I want you to know that every person on the operations team knows. They've known for years. They didn't say anything because they didn't understand that they could." "They can now," Caroline said. Richard Crane sent a handwritten note. This was not a thing Richard typically did. The note was brief and said in its entirety that the announcement had been a long time coming and that he was glad it had come. Susan Merrill sent an email that was longer and warmer and contained in the third paragraph a sentence that Caroline read twice, that she had always introduced Caroline to colleagues as her primary contact at Holloway because that was what was accurate, and that she was glad the firm's official materials would now reflect the same accuracy. Garrett took Marcus and Caroline to dinner at a restaurant in Buckhead that he had chosen with his usual care, and spent the first 20 minutes of the meal saying that he should have spoken up years earlier. Marcus said yes simply and without softening it. Caroline listened to both of them and then said what she had decided she wanted to say. "I know you both saw it. I know you both made your choices about what to do with what you saw. I'm not interested in relitigating those choices." She looked at Garrett, then at Marcus. "What I'm interested in is what we build from here. And I need both of you to understand that I will not be carrying anything invisibly going forward. Not one thing. If something is mine, it will be labeled mine. If something requires my expertise, it will be requested of me directly and acknowledged directly. That is the only arrangement I am available for." Garrett looked at her for a moment. "Understood," he said. Marcus said nothing. He picked up his glass and looked at it and set it down. Then he nodded once slowly, and that was enough. The marriage was harder than the company. Carolyn wants to be honest about this because the alternative would be to offer a resolution that did not happen, and she has spent 6 years in close proximity to the damage that false pictures do. The company had a clear mechanism for correction. Catherine provided it. Documents were signed, roles were formalized, the record was set straight in a way that could be pointed to. The marriage did not have a Catherine. It had two people who loved each other and had built over 6 years a structure so embedded in their daily lives that dismantling it required them to examine every room. They went to Dr. Patricia Webb. She was 53 with an office in a building near Piedmont Park that had the particular quality of a space that has absorbed a great deal of difficult emotion and remained stable anyway. She was calm in the way that certain people are calm, not because they have avoided difficulty, but because they have passed through enough of it to stop being frightened by its presence. She did not let either of them be comfortable. Caroline had expected this, had wanted it, and was still occasionally surprised by how precisely Dr. Webb identified the places where comfort had been functioning as a substitute for honesty. In their third session, Dr. Webb asked Marcus to describe the moment, if he could locate one, when he had understood that the arrangement in the marriage had become unbalanced. Marcus thought about it for a long time. "Year 3, he said finally. "When Diana joined the firm, I watched Caroline work with her for about a month, and I understood watching them that what Caroline was doing was not occasional help. It was not consulting or advising. It was a full-time operational role being performed without any of the recognition that a full-time operational role carries. And I understood that, and I filed it, and I moved on. Dr. Webb looked at him. Why? Because dealing with it would have required me to change the structure of something that was working for me, he said. The company was growing. The marriage was functional. My mother was at peace with the picture she had of our lives. Changing any one of those things felt like a risk I didn't want to take. So you chose maintenance over correction? Yes. Dr. Webb turned to Caroline. And you continued to operate within that choice? I did. Why? Caroline had thought about this question before, in the weeks since the dinner party in the late hours when she had let herself examine the architecture of her own decisions rather than only the architecture of the firm. Because I had made invisibility into a form of control, she said. If I was the only one who knew how everything worked, I was in some way indispensable. The company could not function without me even if no one said so. That felt like security. She paused. What I did not account for was that indispensability without acknowledgement is not security. It is a different kind of trap. The room was quiet. That, Dr. Webb said, is where we begin. They were still in that work a year later. Caroline says this plainly because she will not dress a process in the clothing of a conclusion. The therapy did not fix the marriage the way Catherine's documents fixed the firm's structure. It created instead a set of conditions under which two people could see each other more accurately and make more honest choices about what they wanted to build. Some days the conditions held well, some days they required maintenance. This was Dr. Webb told them the accurate description of what repair looks like in practice, not a dramatic restoration, but a daily renegotiation carried out by people who have decided the effort is worth making. Caroline had decided it was worth making. So had Marcus. That was not nothing. 1 year after the dinner party, Halloway Consulting published a case study on compliance restructuring for mid-sized distribution companies. The case study had been a year in development. It described in precise and practical terms the methodology that Caroline had first deployed during the compliance audit 2 years earlier, the audit where Susan Merrill's team had spent 3 weeks working with her to rebuild an entire documentation framework from the ground up. The case study had Caroline's name on it as primary author. Marcus had insisted on this. He had not suggested it or proposed it or floated it as an option. He had stated it as a requirement the way he stated things in client meetings when he was not negotiating but closing. Caroline's name on the document, period. She had allowed it, not with hesitation, but with the particular quality of allowing that belongs to someone who has stopped needing permission for things that were already hers. The case study was distributed to the firm's existing client network and posted to the company's professional profiles. Within 3 weeks, it had produced 4 inbound inquiries from companies that had found it through industry associations and wanted to discuss similar projects. One of those inquiries came from a mid-sized distribution company based in Birmingham. The operations director had read the case study twice and wanted to understand the methodology in detail. He asked specifically to speak with the author. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday morning in October, 13 months after the dinner party at Halloway's offices in Atlanta. Caroline arrived first. She set up the conference room the way she always set up rooms for client meetings, the materials arranged in the order they would be used, the chairs positioned to allow conversation without the formality of a presentation format, the window blinds adjusted to manage the morning light. These were habits she had developed over 12 years of operational work, and she performed them without thinking the same way she had always performed the work of preparation. Marcus arrived 7 minutes later. He looked at the room at the arrangement and said nothing for a moment. "Ready?" he asked. "Yes," she said. The client arrived on time, a man named Douglas 51, with the particular alertness of someone who has been dealing with a real operational problem for long enough that he can identify quickly whether the person in front of him actually understands it or is going to spend the meeting performing understanding. He understood the distinction within the first 5 minutes. He could see that Caroline had read his company's publicly available materials, had identified the specific points of friction that his operations director had described in the initial inquiry, and had already formulated, at least in outline, a structural approach to addressing them. He asked detailed questions. She answered them with the specificity of someone who has spent 12 years thinking about these problems and 6 additional years applying those thoughts to a real company in real time. Marcus sat across the table and watched, not as a face waiting to perform, not as the closer waiting for the moment to lean in with warmth and conviction, as someone genuinely seeing something, letting himself see it fully, not managing his response to it, but simply receiving it. The meeting ran 45 minutes past its scheduled end time because Douglas kept asking questions and Caroline kept answering them in ways that produced new questions. At the end, Douglas said he wanted to bring his full leadership team to a follow-up meeting. He shook Caroline's hand, then Marcus's, then Caroline's again. After he left the room, held a particular quality of quiet. Marcus looked at his wife across the table. "You're extraordinary," he said. The word landed differently than it would have a year earlier. A year earlier, it would have felt like discovery. Now it felt like confirmation, the specific weight of a truth that has been examined from every angle and found to hold. "I know," Caroline said, "not with performance, with the settled quality of someone who has stopped waiting for the statement to be made and has simply moved forward on the basis of knowing it herself." They drove home in separate cars. Caroline had taken her own vehicle because she had a call scheduled before the meeting. The practical logistics of a professional life that was finally organized around her actual role rather than around its absence. On the drive, she thought about Eleanor. They had dinner with her now once a month at a restaurant in Midtown that they had chosen together because it was equidistant from the house and from Eleanor's hotel when she came to Atlanta. The dinners were careful at first, then gradually less careful, then something that she would not call easy but would call real. Eleanor asked questions now about the firm, about specific clients, about the operational challenges that Caroline was currently working through. She did not ask them from a distance as social courtesy. She asked them with the specific attention of someone who is genuinely trying to understand something she had long pretended she already understood. Caroline answered, fully, without editing herself down to a version she thought was receivable. At a dinner in the late spring, about 8 months after the phone call, Eleanor had said something that stayed with Caroline for a long time afterward. They've been talking about the compliance restructuring methodology, the one that had become the case study, and Eleanor had asked a precise technical question about vendor tiering that suggested she had been thinking about the conversation from their previous dinner and had done some reading in between. Caroline answered the question. Eleanor listened, asked a follow-up, listened again. Then she said quietly, setting her water glass down with the deliberate movement of someone who has decided to say a thing they have been carrying for a while. "I want you to know that I understand what I took from you, not just the recognition, the years, the way you had to hold yourself back in rooms where you should have been able to be fully present." She did not look away. "I can't give those back, but I want you to know I understand the weight of them." Caroline looked at her mother-in-law across the table. "I know you understand," she said. "That matters." It was not absolution. Processes do not complete themselves at dinner tables over water glasses, no matter how genuine the words spoken across them. But something real was being built. Carefully, with full awareness of what it was replacing, and with no illusions about how long it would take. That was enough for now. The back office at the house looked different than it had a year earlier. The same desk, the same window, the same cup that always held coffee in varying states of temperature. But the framed credentials on the wall were new. The project management certifications that Caroline had renewed 3 months earlier, as she renewed them every 3 years because the discipline of staying current did not change based on whether anyone was watching. Behind them new was a printed copy of the firm's updated letterhead, her name on it below Marcus's above the firm's contact information. She had put it there herself not as a display but as a daily reminder of something she was still learning to receive, that being seen did not require her to become smaller in order to fit someone else's frame. Lily had noticed it on the first day it went up. She had come into the office after school, dropped her backpack on the floor as she always did, and then stopped and looked at the wall. "Is that the company's paper?" she asked. "It's the letterhead, the paper they use for official documents." Lily looked at it for another moment. "Your name is on it?" "Yes." "Was it on it before?" "No." Lily considered this with the focused seriousness she brought to things she did not yet have language for. Then she picked up her backpack and left. That evening after dinner, she came to find Caroline in the office. She stood in the doorway with a piece of paper she had evidently been working on since getting home, a drawing done in her careful, effortful 7-year-old hand. She had drawn two figures standing side by side, labeled in her printing, Mom and Dad, with the word company written above them and an arrow pointing to both. She held it up. "For your wall," she said. Caroline took the drawing and looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at her daughter. There are things a woman understands about her own life that she cannot fully articulate until she sees them reflected in something simple, something that has not been complicated by the years of careful management and strategic silence and invisible labor. Lily's drawing was not complicated. It showed two people in one company, and it pointed to both of them equally. It was the most accurate organizational chart anyone had ever produced for Holloway Consulting Group. Caroline taped it to the wall beside the letterhead. She thought about the kitchen table where it had all started, the stack of disorganized books, and the 3 weeks of work and the specific quality of attention she had given to a business that was not yet hers in any official sense. She thought about the calculation she had made and the cost of that decision that had nothing to do with money. She thought about what she would say to a woman standing now at the beginning of a similar calculation. Not that the decision was wrong, not that visibility is always better than invisibility, or that patience is always a failure of nerve. The calculation had its own logic, and the logic had served real purposes. What she would say is this: know the price before you agree to it. Know that invisibility chosen for the right reasons has an expiration date, and that date is determined by you, not by the people who benefit from the arrangement. Know that the moment you stop choosing it and start simply inhabiting it is the moment it stops being a strategy and becomes a condition. And know when you reach that moment that you have receipts. She had hers. 7 years of them organized with the precision that had always been her natural mode, documented with dates and figures and outcomes attached to each item. The truth had arrived late, but it had arrived whole. And she had been the one standing there to receive it, in the specific company of a woman who finally understood what she had been looking at all along, and a daughter who had drawn a picture that said in 7-year-old printing and a careful arrow exactly what the situation had always been. She turned off the desk lamp. She went to find her family.